Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's this month's patron pick, and the topic that was selected was a discussion on the theoretical and philosophical aspects of card templating. If you've been following the channel for a while, you know that I am a big-time templating nerd, so if you find this stuff as interesting as me, you're sure to be in for a fun time. To start off, what is templating? In this video, I'll be using that term to refer specifically to the choice of what words are used to communicate what the cards do. This is an extremely important yet often overlooked aspect of card design, until it's done poorly, in which case it sticks out horribly. With that said, let's try to characterize what separates a good template from a bad one. The way I see it, there are three really fundamental goals when choosing how to word a card, which we'll discuss in turn. The first principle is that a card with less words is better than a card with more words. Even before we hit the physical limit of how many cards could fit on a card, there's the mental limit of how much stuff that a Magic player can process before giving up and warming up another card game with less text on the cards. So how do we get less words on the cards? Well, for an example of one tried and true method, let's take a look at the original printing of the Hive and compare it to the 4th ed version. And yeah, that's quite a difference, huh? Where'd all that text go? Well, it didn't just disappear. To find it, we're going to have to take a trip to my favorite 250-page technical document, the Comprehensive Rules. And sure enough, we find a whole section on how tokens work, which spells out the answers to these and all the other questions about how these 1-1 WASP tokens function that were explicitly printed on that original version, plus a whole bunch more that have come up along the years. While it may seem like this just kicks the can down the road, moving explanations of how the cards work from the actual cards themselves to the CR actually does have a benefit. There's a cap on how many things that people can work with in their head at once. But if you can abstract those things that go together into categories, then you can deal with the categories themselves as things in their own right, increasing the complexity of what you can work with. This phenomenon is called chunking, and exploiting it is a huge cheat code in terms of improving people's mental performance. For example, there was a famous experiment where they showed chess players a bunch of chess positions and asked them to memorize what pieces were present and where they were. Predictably, the expert players were much better at this task than the novices. Then, the experimenters changed the task slightly. Rather than showing participants positions that had actually come up in actual games, they showed positions with the same number of pieces just randomly distributed on the board. And at this, the performance of the experts dropped to become much closer to the novices. The experts could remember real positions much better because after years of training they were able to recognize patterns and think of the positions in terms of those features, a protected passed pawn, bishops of opposite color, a pinned queen, rather than individual pieces. The same thing happens in Magic, invisibly increasing the type of cards that players can deal with. Here's another great example of this principle. Let's compare the original version of Raging River with the modern counterpart with updated wording, and wow, it's good to see that some things haven't changed in 30 years. I mean, the words are different, but the length really isn't. So what's the problem? Well, unlike creature tokens, the mechanic of making it so that creatures on the wrong side of the river couldn't block didn't end up having the same kind of staying power. While chunking is great for reducing the perceived complexity of mechanics, there's one major drawback. It takes mental energy to form the association of a chunk in the first place. Once you know how a mechanic works, the fact that it always works the same way helps you keep track of everything. But until that point, you have to look it up. And you're not looking it up on the card, you have to go, stop the game, and do something else to get the answer. For repeated mechanics, this isn't a problem because people get used to them very quickly. But it doesn't make sense to make a new CR section for a one-off mechanic that's likely never going to show up again. Okay, fine, great. Anyway, another way that Magic removes text from the cards is by using keywords. Although reminder text is still present on many cards that explains what the keyword does, many other cards do not have anything that goes on except the keyword. For these cards that use reminder text, it's always in italics, signaling to players that they don't need to read it. This principle is also behind the trend of shedding words from cards in general. For example, back in my day, the Birds of Paradise on Ravnica added mana to your mana pool. These remastered ones just add mana. My old tutor always taught me to beware of the generosity of demons, but then he shuffled my library afterwards. These new ones are a lot more mysterious about what you're shuffling. Any word that can be left off of a card saves money on ink and increases the amount of other complicated stuff that you can cram on there. But aside from those great benefits, it also makes it easier for players to read and understand what the cards do. The second principle of templating is that complicated templates are worse than simple ones. The reasons for this are, again, obvious, so let's take a look at a few examples that illustrate this point. Since we were just talking about changes to commonly repeated game phrases, here's one that you might remember given that it took place pretty recently, replacing the term converted mana cost with mana value. There were a lot of questions for a long time that stemmed from confusion between the former term and the related yet distinct mana cost. Before that, you might remember the change from colorless mana to generic mana when referring to costs, and back in my day, we didn't enter the battlefield, much less enter, we came into play. All of these changes were directed towards making it more obvious what the intended functionality of the cards was. This goes beyond just applying the terminology for gameplay-related vocabulary. For example, when Streets of New Capenna came out, I got more requests to cover Lagrella the Magpie than any other card. Many of these weren't even questions about specific interactions, they were just general questions about how this card worked. The effect isn't even that complicated by modern standards. I believe the majority of the confusion came from the unclear templating. The sentence is just so weird and it has so much stuff crammed in there in non-natural ways. Earlier on, the card Dead Ringers was notorious for the same issue. The wording is just so abstruse that very few players were able to correctly parse out the correct interpretation for what it did, destroying two creatures that were each exactly the same color or colors. I'd be interested to hear from my international viewers if these cards caused as much confusion in other languages as they did in English. On the other hand, Mindslaver was able to cram an incredibly complicated process into just a few lines of text, and reminder text. The reason that this card could see print at all is because the normal English meaning of those words matched very close with what you were supposed to do, making this possible. Another fine example is Time Stop. Although the original version of this card used a full slate of reminder text to spell out exactly what ending the turn meant, by the time it was reprinted in 10th edition, it was decided that the process was intuitive enough that the foil version was printed with just 3 words of rules text. In a similar vein, none of the versions of Karn Liberated offer any explanation for what restarting the game means at all, and for most normal situations, the players are able to figure it out just fine. Of course, all these examples only work because the required gameplay actions are spelled out with the English meaning of the words involved. Here's a fun fact. Banding originally didn't have any reminder text. In fact, there isn't a single physical Magic card that spells out how banding works at all. Now, for some keyword abilities, this might fly. After all, even a non-Magic player could probably reach deep down and come up with a hasty guess for what indestructible means. But a lot of people can't even figure out how banding works even with the reminder text. So if you threw out that little rules booklet that came with your tournament pack, then you might be stuck calling the WotC support phone line. Or email users could try emailing their questions in. Finally, let's talk about the third major principle of templating. This is the one that gave the concept of templating its very name. Identical mechanics should use exactly the same words to describe them. Discrete mechanics should use clearly different words. For example, if you've been following the channel for a while now, you probably already know that there is a difference between losing 1 life and taking 1 damage. Even though the physical actions that you're going to be taking with your pen and your life pad are exactly the same, as far as the game is concerned, they're completely different. Things besides players can take damage, but not lose life. If you as a player take damage, that probably causes you to lose life, but not always. Lifelink does not interact with losing life, but only dealing damage. Triggered abilities and replacement effects need to be carefully examined to see which one they applied to, and so on. Because they're different game concepts, we have 2 different templates to represent them. Specific words are used to describe concepts like these, and those words are only used to describe that concept. If you have a background in computer programming, this should probably seem familiar to you. You can't name a variable if. Even if the programming language lets you do something like that, you still shouldn't. If is already used for something else in programming. Using it in some other way would just be confusing. Contrarily, when cycling debuted in Urza's block, there were only 3 cards with cycling in Urza's Legacy, the final set of the block. This is in contrast to the 10 in Urza's Destiny and 34 in Urza's Saga. For those of you who started playing after the block structure was discontinued, the first set of the block usually had on the order of double the number of cards, maybe a few more, which explains the difference why Urza's Saga had so many more cards with cycling. But the other 2 sets were the same size, so how can we explain why Urza's Legacy had so many less? And the answer to that is that Urza's Legacy also had 8 additional creatures which had an ability that lets you pay 2 mana and sacrifice them to draw a card. Internally, WotC referred to this as cycling from play. The only problem is that without the word cycling on these creatures, No one recognized them as having that mechanic, even though it worked basically the same way. Mero told a story about how even years later he still got questions about why there were so few cycling cards in that set. The message is clear. In order to get recognized as being the same, close doesn't cut it. You need to be exactly the same. Nowadays, we would expect some sort of ability word to be on these cards to tie them together. That's right, the modern solution to this issue is to add more words to the cards, completely counter to the first principle that we talked about. From a rules standpoint, triggered abilities, activated abilities, replacement effects, and linked abilities all use characteristic templates. In many cases, the presence or absence of such a template is the only way to know what type of ability that you're dealing with, and thus what rules are applicable. For example, all activated abilities contain a colon. If you don't see one of those, you can't call it an activated ability. Another famous example of this is triggered abilities that have an intervening if clause. Did you know that the ability on Triumph of Ferocity is actually functionally different from the ability on Colossal Majesty? The reason is the position of the if condition within the sentence. I think it's frankly no less than miraculous that all of the languages that Magic has been printed in seem to have the same grammatical freedom to preserve this difference when the cards are translated. Now, speaking of translations, I feel like this deserves a special mention in an episode about templating. There are a couple of specific card games that I can think of that have a reputation for being somewhat less careful than Magic when it comes to staying consistent like this. I can't help but wonder if the amount of inconsistencies is maybe due in part to the fact that English speakers can only play these games in translation. In contrast, the Magic localization team deserves nothing but the highest praise for their efforts to translate Magic cards consistently. My international audience regularly reports that even very fine grammatical differences that translate into gameplay significant details are faithfully translated into their own languages. From personal experience, I can say that this is an absolutely huge thing for someone playing Magic in another language. Even though I couldn't read Chinese, when I was playing Magic in China, I was able to do so very successfully, even with new cards at a pre-release, just on the basis of a vague recollection of what the card did from the spoilers and the ability to recognize some technical Magic terms like mana cost, power, the card types, and common keywords. The card art was the top factor in my being able to play in a foreign language, but the templating easily took the number 2 spot. Whew, that was a lot of information, and this is such a deep topic, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface. With this starting point, you should be able to critique the templates that you encounter, and hopefully appreciate this bit of Magic card design a little bit more for yourself. When WotC releases a new wording for your favorite card, try to identify which of the 3 templating goals that change is serving, and see if you can think of why some alternatives might not have made the cut. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you again to all of my patrons and anyone who supports this channel in any way. Join me again for another daily ruling, and until then, I hope you have a great day.